What if I told you that the first hour of your morning is either building your future or silently destroying it? Not because of luck, not because of talent, but because of what you do or fail to do before 8 a.m. There are people who wake up every day and attract success like a magnet, and others who stay stuck in the same cycle of stress, delay, and regret. The difference, a hidden morning code most people ignore. Now imagine this: a woman who once claimed to practice dark rituals and energy manipulation steps forward and says, I used to believe power came from outside forces, but I discovered the real power was in the first 60 minutes after waking. She doesn't talk about magic anymore. She talks about discipline, energy, and what she calls the morning alignment window. Her name is Mara Vairel, originally from Romania, a country long associated with folklore, mystery, and ancient legends of mysticism. But Mara is no longer practicing witchcraft. She now calls herself an energy reformer, someone who studies how habits shape mindset, destiny, and daily outcomes. And according to her, there are six key actions before 8 a.m. that can completely change a person's life trajectory. Most people underestimate how fragile the mind is in the first moments after waking up. Yet, this is exactly when keynote 1, silence before noise, becomes one of the most powerful psychological leverage points in a person's entire day. When you wake up, your brain is not immediately in its fully logical state. Instead, it transitions slowly from theta and delta brainwave patterns associated with sleep into more alert beta states. In this transitional window, your mind is unusually suggestible, meaning whatever you expose yourself to first has a disproportionate influence on your emotional tone, attention direction, and even decision making patterns. This is why reaching for a phone immediately after waking can quietly shape an entire day without you realizing it. Notifications, messages, news, and social media are not neutral inputs. They are emotionally charged stimuli designed to capture attention. Even a single stressful message or negative headline can trigger a subtle cortisol response, nudging your nervous system into a reactive state before you have even consciously formed your own thoughts. Silence, in this context, is not emptiness, but a form of protection. It creates a psychological buffer between sleep and the external world, allowing your internal system to stabilize before being influenced. When a person sits in silence during this early phase, something interesting happens. Thoughts begin to surface naturally without external interference, often revealing priorities, worries, or creative ideas that were suppressed during sleep. This is why many high performance individuals describe early morning silence as a form of mental calibration, where the brain organizes itself before being programmed by outside input. Even 10 minutes of this practice can reduce impulsive reactions later in the day because the mind learns to observe rather than instantly react. Silence also strengthens what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to notice your own thoughts as they arise. Without it, people often confuse external noise with internal truth, leading to decisions shaped by urgency rather than clarity. There is also a neurological angle to this. When you avoid immediate stimulation, dopamine levels rise more gradually, preventing the sharp spikes and crashes associated with constant digital input. Over time, this can improve focus stability and reduce dependency on constant novelty. In contrast, jumping directly into digital consumption floods the brain with rapid reward signals, training it to expect constant stimulation and making sustained attention more difficult throughout the day. Silence before noise is therefore not just a spiritual or philosophical idea. It is a form of cognitive conditioning that reshapes how attention is allocated. It teaches the brain that stillness is safe rather than something to escape from. This alone can shift a person's baseline stress level without changing any external circumstance. Closely connected to this is keynote 2, water before words, which appears simple on the surface but carries layers of physiological and behavioral significance that most people never consider. After several hours of sleep, the human body is naturally in a mild state of dehydration because perspiration, and metabolic processes continue throughout the night. This means that upon waking, blood viscosity is slightly higher, cognitive processing speed is marginally reduced, and physical energy may feel low even before emotional or environmental factors are introduced. Drinking water immediately after waking is not just about hydration, it is about rapidly restoring baseline biological efficiency. The act of consuming water signals the body that a new cycle of activity has begun, activating the digestive system, improving circulation, transport to the brain. This physiological reset can subtly improve alertness and reduce the grogginess often associated with sleep inertia. But beyond biology, there is a symbolic dimension that influences behavior in ways people rarely acknowledge. Choosing water before engaging in speech, conversation, or digital communication creates a deliberate pause between internal restoration and external expression. It interrupts the habit of immediate reaction, reinforcing the idea that the self should be nourished before it is exposed to influence or demanded by others. Many people wake up and immediately begin responding to messages, to requests, to expectations, without first stabilizing their own internal state. Over time, this creates a pattern where external voices consistently override internal needs. Water before words reverses that pattern by prioritizing self regulation before communication. There is also an interesting cognitive link between hydration and emotional regulation. Even mild dehydration has been shown to affect mood stability, increasing irritability, reducing patience, and impairing working memory. This means that a person who begins their day dehydrated may unconsciously interpret neutral situations as more stressful or demanding than they actually are. By rehydrating first, the nervous system gains a more balanced foundation, making emotional responses less volatile. Some behavioral researchers also suggest that small morning rituals like drinking water can act as anchor habits, meaning they serve as a stable trigger that helps structure the rest of the day. When the brain consistently associates waking with hydration, it begins to build a predictable sequence of control, which reduces cognitive load because fewer decisions are needed to start functioning effectively. Interestingly, this also affects communication quality. People who rush into conversation immediately after waking often speak from a reactive state where thoughts are still fragmented and emotionally influenced by sleep residue or external anticipation. In contrast, those who hydrate first tend to experience a slight delay between stimulus and response, which improves clarity and reduces unnecessary emotional escalation in early interactions. Over time, this small delay becomes a form of mental discipline, training the mind to pause before speaking rather than responding impulsively. The combination of physiological restoration and behavior pacing makes water before words a surprisingly powerful mechanism for stabilizing both body and mind at the very start of the day, shaping how energy is distributed across everything that follows. Movement over laziness in the early morning is less about exercise in the traditional sense and more about signaling to the body that inertia is no longer the default state. After several hours of sleep, the human system is naturally in a low activation mode where muscle temperature is reduced, joint stiffness is slightly increased, and neural signaling is slower compared to peak daytime performance. If a person remains still for too long after waking, the body continues to interpret this stillness as a continuation of rest, which can extend grogginess and mental fog far beyond what is necessary. Even small amounts of movement in the first hour, stretching, walking, or light mobility work, trigger a cascade of physiological changes that accelerate full wakefulness. Blood circulation improves, oxygen delivery to the brain increases, and the lymphatic system begins to clear metabolic waste more efficiently. What makes this even more interesting is how movement influences cognition. The brain does not separate physical motion from mental activation. Both systems are deeply interconnected. When the body moves, especially why in a controlled and intentional way, it increases the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine, which are directly tied to focus, alertness, and motivation. This means that a person does not think their way into energy as effectively as they move their way into energy. Laziness in the morning often feels mental, but it is frequently physical inertia disguised as lack of motivation. Once movement begins, motivation often follows rather than precedes it. There is also a psychological dimension to this habit. When someone consistently chooses movement over comfort first thing in the morning, they are essentially practicing microdiscipline. This sends a message to the subconscious mind that resistance does not dictate behavior. Over time, this creates an identity shift where the person begins to see themselves as someone who acts before excuses form. Interestingly, early movement also affects emotional tone. A sedentary start tends to prolong passive thinking patterns, while movement introduces a sense of progress and direction. Even a short walk outside in the morning light can regulate circadian rhythm, helping the body distinguish more clearly between rest and active phases, which improves sleep quality later at night. In this way, a small morning movement routine becomes a feedback loop that strengthens both energy and discipline across the entire day. Direction setting ritual in the morning operates as a cognitive filtering system that determines how attention, energy, and decisions will be distributed throughout the day. When a person wakes up without defined priorities, the mind is forced into reactive mode, constantly responding to external demands, interruptions, and emotionally charged stimuli. This reactive state creates the illusion of productivity while often producing scattered effort and low impact outcomes. By contrast, writing down and or mentally identifying three clear priorities before 8 a.m. introduces structure into an otherwise open mental environment. The limitation to three is significant because it forces prioritization rather than over planning. The brain is naturally drawn to novelty and urgency, so without constraints, it will tend to generate long lists that feel productive but are not actionable. Selecting only three priorities creates cognitive clarity by forcing the mind to distinguish between what is important and what is merely urgent. This process reduces decision fatigue later in the day because the brain no longer needs to repeatedly evaluate what matters most in every situation. It already has a reference point. There is also a neurological benefit to this practice. When goals are clearly defined early in the day, the brain's reticular activating system begins to filter information in alignment with those goals. This means that opportunities, relevant ideas, and useful information become more noticeable simply because the brain is primed to recognize them. Without direction, attention becomes fragmented and even important signals can be overlooked. Another important aspect is emotional regulation. A person without direction often experiences subtle anxiety throughout the day because the mind continuously senses unfinished mental tasks. By defining priorities early, this background cognitive tension is reduced, creating a calmer and more controlled mental environment. Over time, this habit strengthens executive function, which is the brain's ability to manage impulses, sustain attention, and organize behavior towards long term outcomes. It also changes the perception of time itself. Instead of the day feeling like an unpredictable series of events, it becomes a structured sequence where actions are aligned with intention rather than circumstance. This shift is subtle but powerful, because it transforms a person from being carried by the day to actively shaping it. Energy protection in the early morning is less about mystical ideas and more about how the brain and nervous system set emotional boundaries before external influences begin to accumulate. When a person wakes up and immediately exposes themselves to emotionally charged content, arguments, news, social media comparisons, or stressful conversations, the brain begins to absorb those emotional states as if they are part of its own reality. This happens because in the early morning, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational filtering and emotional regulation, is not yet operating at full capacity. As a result, the limbic system, which governs emotion and instinct, has more influence over interpretation. This makes the mind more vulnerable to emotional contagion, where outside moods and tones are unconsciously absorbed. Their energy protection practice, in this sense, is about delaying exposure to emotional interference until the internal system is stable enough to internal system. When someone consciously avoids negativity in the first part of their day, they are essentially preserving a clean emotional baseline. This baseline acts like a reference point for the rest of the day. Without it, every new stimulus can distort mood more easily because there is no stable internal anchor. Even subtle forms of negativity, such as rushed conversations or passive scrolling, can shift attention into comparison or urgency states, which gradually increases internal stress without the person noticing the transition. Protecting energy early also has a cognitive advantage. Attention is a limited resource, and once it is fragmented by external inputs, it becomes harder to restore deep focus later. By shielding the mind from unnecessary emotional noise before 8 a.m., a person preserves cognitive bandwidth for tasks that actually matter. There is also a behavioral dimension. What you allow into your mind early sets a permission structure for the rest of the day. If chaos is accepted first, the brain becomes more tolerant of distraction later. If clarity is protected first, the brain tends to maintain that standard. Over time, this creates a self reinforcing loop where the quality of morning input determines the quality of daily decisions. Emotional stability also becomes more predictable because the person is not constantly resetting their mood based on external triggers. Instead, they operate from a more controlled internal state that is less reactive and more intentional. This is why energy protection is often linked to improved productivity, although the real mechanism is not productivity itself, but reduced emotional volatility, which allows consistent focus to emerge naturally. Identity affirmation, on the other hand, works by shaping the internal narrative that the brain uses to interpret behavior and setbacks throughout the day. When a person speaks or thinks statements like, I am disciplined or I am focused in the morning, it may seem symbolic, but it interacts with a deeper psychological system known as self schema. A self schema is essentially the brain's internal model of who I am, and it influences how actions are interpreted. For example, if a person sees themselves as disciplined, then small acts of consistency feel reinforcing rather than effortful. While failures are interpreted as temporary deviations rather than identity defining events, this distinction is critical because behavior alone does not determine long term habits. Identity interpretation does. Without positive identity reinforcement, the brain often labels inconsistency as personal failure, which leads to discouragement and reduced motivation over time. Identity affirmation helps interrupt that cycle by preloading the mind with a chosen identity before external challenges appear. There is also a neurological angle related to repetition and neural pathways. When identity based statements are repeated consistently, even if initially they feel artificial, the brain begins to strengthen associated neural networks that align behavior with that identity. This is not instant transformation, but gradual conditioning. Over time, actions that match the affirmed identity require less conscious effort because they become more automatic. Another important aspect is emotional resilience. When identity is unstable, external outcomes have greater power to influence self worth. A bad morning can create a feeling of being unproductive or incapable, which then cascades into further negative behavior. Identity affirmation creates a buffer against this by separating temporary outcomes from core self perception. It allows a person to fail at a task without redefining themselves as a failure, which is crucial for long term growth. Additionally, speaking identity statements aloud has a stronger effect than silent thought because vocalization engages multiple sensory systems, reinforcing belief through auditory and motor feedback loops. Over time, this practice can subtly shift behavior patterns, not be because words are magical, but because repeated identity cues guide attention, interpretation, and decision making in a more consistent direction aligned with the chosen self concept. In the end, what all of this really comes down to is not mystery, luck, or hidden forces, but the quiet power of how you begin your day before the world fully gets access to your mind. The first moments after waking are like an open gate. Whatever you allow in during that time starts shaping your thoughts, your emotions, and eventually your actions for the rest of the day. If you fill that space with noise, distraction, and emotional chaos, you often carry that same scattered energy forward without realizing it. But if you intentionally choose silence, hydration, movement, direction, protection, and identity alignment, you are essentially training your mind to operate from clarity instead of reaction. Over time, these small morning decisions compound into something much bigger than a routine. They become the foundation of your discipline, your focus, and even your self belief. The difference between people who feel stuck and people who feel in control is rarely one big moment. It is usually a series of small, repeated choices made when no one is watching, especially in the early morning hours. When you learn to own your morning, you slowly begin to own your mindset. And when you own your mindset, you start to influence the direction of your entire life in a more intentional way. So the real question is not whether these practices work, but whether you are willing to practice them consistently enough for them to work for you. And if you found value in this, make sure you subscribe, stay connected, and don't miss the next one because the next idea might be the one that changes everything for you.